Somalia has the longest coastline in continental Africa, 3,333 kilometers of open water, rich enough in fish that experts believe the country could sustainably harvest well over 200,000 metric tons of seafood every single year. And yet for most of the last 3 decades, Somalia has barely fished its own ocean at all. Instead, foreign trawlers from Europe and Asia moved in and took what they wanted, virtually unopposed, while the actual owners of that water watched their livelihood disappear from the shore. What happened next became one of the most infamous criminal industries of the 21st century. Hijacked oil tankers, multi-million-dollar ransoms, international navies patrolling an ocean thousands of miles from home. And it started, almost unbelievably, with fishermen just trying to defend their own catch. This is the story of how a collapsed state, a stolen ocean, and a group of furious local fishermen produced modern piracy exactly as the world came to know it. Hijacked tankers, Navy SEAL rescues, multi-million-dollar ransoms, and how, underneath all of that chaos, a real fishing industry is still quietly trying to claw its way back today. Start with the water itself. Somalia's coastline stretches 3,333 kilometers, longer than any other country in continental Africa, running along some of the most biologically rich fishing grounds in the western Indian Ocean, home to migratory tuna, valuable lobster, and reef species that should, on paper, make this one of the continent's most productive fishing economies. The sustainable potential is enormous. Researchers estimate the country could harvest more than 200,000 metric tons of fish a year without depleting the resource. Much of that richness comes from geography most people never think about. Twice a year, seasonal monsoon winds trigger upwelling along Somalia's coast between roughly 5 and 10 degrees north latitude, pulling cold, nutrient-rich water up from the depths and turning that stretch of ocean into some of the most productive tuna grounds in the western Indian Ocean. Yellowfin, big eye, and skipjack tuna among the most highly prized species locally, alongside mackerel and reef fish. What actually gets caught tells a very different story. In 2022, Somalia's own artisanal fishers, working from small boats with handlines and nets, landed around 6,000 metric tons. Foreign industrial vessels operating illegally in the same waters that year took an estimated 13,000 metric tons, more than double what the country's own fishermen caught, in waters that legally belong to Somalia. One widely cited United Nations estimate puts the value of seafood stolen from Somali waters by illegal foreign fishing at around $300 million a year. Demand tells its own strange part of this story. Somalia's per capita fish consumption is among the lowest anywhere on Earth, and yet urban demand is climbing fast. Mogadishu alone now moves an estimated 9 tons of fish a day through its central market, supplying inland distribution across the country, even as the nation as a whole eats a fraction of the global average. The market for Somali fish, in other words, is not fully formed yet, even inside Somalia itself. This is a story about a country with plenty of fish that for most of a generation has not been allowed to actually catch them. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to a fishing industry that Somalia actually built on purpose. Under President Siad Barre's socialist government, which ruled from 1969 to 1991, fishing became a deliberate national project. After severe droughts hit the country through the 1970s, the government relocated displaced nomadic herders, people whose entire way of life depended on livestock and open grazing land, into newly formed fishing cooperatives along the coast, explicitly trying to reduce their vulnerability to future droughts by giving them a different livelihood entirely. The Soviet Union backed the program, donating fishing gear and motorized boats to get the cooperatives running. It did not go smoothly. Centralized state marketing through the 1970s and early 1980s gave fishermen little financial incentive to actually increase how much they caught, and the sector struggled with a shortage of spare parts, limited repair knowledge, and almost no proper storage infrastructure. Then, in the late 1970s, the Soviets broke with Barre over his war with Ethiopia, and he expelled his Soviet advisors entirely, tearing up the Friendship Treaty and pivoting the country toward the West. The fishing sector limped through a partial liberalization in the 1980s, genuinely growing, but never the industry the original cooperative program had promised. For people who had spent generations moving livestock across open rangeland, The entire premise of the cooperative program asked for a wholesale change of identity, not just a new job, trading the rhythm of herding animals for the rhythm of reading tides and repairing engines, with a state bureaucracy setting prices in between. Some communities adapted, many never fully did, and the sector never grew past a fraction of what its coastline could theoretically support. Then, in 1991, the entire Somali state collapsed. Siad Barre's government fell, and no functioning replacement took its place. No central government, no navy, and critically, no coast guard. Somalia's 3,333 kilometers of coastline, longer than any other countries on the continent, was suddenly guarded by absolutely nobody. There was a second, quieter obstacle sitting underneath the security crisis, one with nothing to do with foreign trawlers at all. Most Somalis simply don't eat much fish. Somalia's per capita fish consumption sits at roughly 2.4 to 3.3 kilograms a year, according to World Bank figures, a fraction of the global average of around 19 kilograms. Somalia has historically been a pastoralist society, built around livestock and red meat, and that cultural preference did not change just because the coastline was rich in fish. Coastal and riverine communities eat fish regularly. Inland pastoralist populations largely don't. Even a fully rebuilt, perfectly secure fishing industry would still have to solve a domestic demand problem that had nothing to do with pirates or trawlers. Foreign fishing fleets noticed almost immediately. Through the 1990s, European and Asian trawlers moved into Somali waters and fished at industrial scale, deploying nets that swept up everything in their path, with no coast guard to stop them and no functioning Somali government able to enforce any kind of fishing law. This was not occasional poaching. It became, by most accounts, the dominant pattern in Somali waters for years. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing operating essentially in the open. Some estimates from this period put the volume taken by foreign fleets at several times what Somalia's own artisanal sector could ever have caught with hand lines and small boats. An extraction rate closer to industrial strip mining than to fishing, carried out against a country with no way to even document what was being taken from its own water, let alone stop it. Local fishermen did not simply watch this happen. Starting in the early to mid-1990s, coastal communities began organizing informal patrols specifically to chase away the foreign trawlers stripping their waters. At first, this was controversial even within Somalia. Armed fishermen confronting foreign industrial vessels was, by any normal definition, an act of vigilantism. But by the late 1990s, what had been condemned started to be condoned, and eventually actively encouraged by many of the same coastal communities losing their livelihoods to the trawlers. Here is the detail that turns this from a local dispute into the origin of a global crisis. Fishermen who seized an unlicensed foreign trawler could reliably count on a ransom payment because the trawler's owners did not want international attention drawn to the fact that they were fishing illegally in the first place. Word spread. What began as coastal communities defending their own fishing grounds evolved into something much bigger, an economy built around seizing vessels for ransom, no longer limited to the trawlers that had actually stolen the fish. By the mid-2000s, this had grown into full-scale Somali piracy, the crisis that eventually forced international navies to patrol the Gulf of Aden, spawned dedicated task forces from multiple countries, and became one of the defining maritime security stories of the decade, the version most people around the world actually know, largely disconnected in public memory from the fishing dispute that started it. One town captures that transformation better than any statistic. Eyl, a small fishing settlement on Puntland's coast, had spent generations as exactly what it looked like, an isolated, impoverished village of local fishers, hemmed in by rocky hills with no good roads connecting it to anywhere else. By the mid-2000s, that same isolation made it perfect for something else entirely. Eyl became the de facto capital of Somali piracy, the place where hijacked crews were held and ransoms negotiated, until international naval pressure and local governance efforts curbed the activity there by around 2012. The piracy crisis produced one story famous enough that most viewers have already seen it, even without knowing the fishing dispute behind it. On April 8, 2009, 4 Somali pirates hijacked the U.S.-flagged cargo ship Maersk Alabama, roughly 240 nautical miles southeast of Eyl. Captain Phillips surrendered himself to the hijackers to protect his crew, was held hostage for 5 days aboard a lifeboat and was ultimately freed when Navy SEAL snipers killed 3 of his 4 captors in a single coordinated shot. The surviving pirate, a teenager named Abduwali Muse, was sentenced to more than 33 years in a U.S. federal prison. It was the first successful hijacking of an American-flagged vessel in nearly 2 centuries, and it became the basis for the 2013 film Captain Phillips, which most people who lived through that era have actually seen, even if they never connected it to a fight over stolen tuna. There's one more, murkier thread tangled into this same origin story. After the December 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the United Nations Environment Program reported that the waves had broken open old barrels along Somalia's shoreline, and that some contained illegally dumped hazardous and possibly nuclear waste, allegedly deposited by European companies since the 1980s. It is a powerful, damning claim, and it is genuinely contested. A UN technical fact-finding mission sent to investigate later in 2005 did not find toxic waste traces at the sites it inspected. A Somali NGO's own 2006 survey claimed to identify 15 containers of confirmed nuclear and chemical waste at 8 coastal locations. But that finding was never independently verified by international investigators. What's not in dispute is the effect. Whether or not the specific claim holds up, the belief that foreign companies were poisoning Somali waters on top of stealing its fish became part of the justification coastal communities used for turning against foreign vessels. Grievance layered on top of grievance, verified or not. Even the clean version of this story, angry fishermen forced into piracy by foreign theft, does not fully hold up under scrutiny, and it is worth being honest about where it breaks down. Once ransom payments proved reliably lucrative, researchers who study the period argue the underlying motive shifted. What started as retaliation against specific trawlers that had actually stolen Somali fish became, for many of the armed groups involved, simple hijacking for profit against any valuable vessel passing through the region, regardless of whether that vessel had anything to do with fishing at all. The wronged fisherman narrative explains how the crisis started. It does not fully explain how large, organized, and disconnected from fishing the later piracy economy actually became. Piracy peaked in 2011, and the numbers from that single year show exactly how far the crisis had drifted from its origins. Attacks reached a record 237 that year alone. More than 3,863 seafarers were fired on with assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. The global economic cost that year is estimated at somewhere between $6.6 and $7 billion, $2.7 billion of it just in extra fuel burned by ships speeding through high-risk waters, another $1.3 billion in military operations, and $1.1 billion in security equipment and armed guards, with the shipping industry itself absorbing roughly 80% of the total bill. Average ransoms climbed to $5 million per ship that year, and pirates collected a combined $160 million in ransom payments in 2011 alone. Weighed against the illegal foreign fishing that started it, real and estimated at roughly $300 million a year in stolen seafood, the retaliation had, by this point, grown into something wildly disproportionate to the original theft. International naval patrols, coordinated missions including the European Union's EU NAVFOR, succeeded in suppressing large-scale piracy through the mid-2010s, and hijackings dropped sharply for the better part of a decade. But the actual root problem, illegal foreign fishing in unguarded Somali waters, was never solved. It just stopped making international headlines. And in 2024 and 2025, the underlying tension resurfaced in the worst possible way. After roughly 18 months without a single successful hijacking, Somali pirates seized the Malta-flagged tanker Hellas Aphrodite in November 2025, part of a fresh cluster of attacks across the Somali Basin and western Indian Ocean that researchers describe as the most serious wave of incidents since a downturn in mid-2024. Some of the recent seizures reportedly began, once again, as disputes over illegal fishing before escalating into full piracy. The same trigger, 3 decades later, still live. The picture has also gotten more dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with fish at all. A United Nations report from February 2025 found that representatives of Yemen's Houthi movement and Somalia's al-Shabaab militant group had met multiple times to discuss cooperation, with the Houthis reportedly offering weapons and technical expertise in exchange for intensified piracy attacks and coordinated ransom activity. And the ransom economics still work. A reported $5 million payment secured the release of the vessel Abdullah in April 2024 alone. What began as a fisheries dispute is now entangled with regional militant politics and a proven ongoing revenue stream, a much harder problem to solve than the one that started it. A dispute that began with local fishermen chasing away a single unlicensed trawler now shares a supply line with a regional weapons network stretching from Yemen to the Horn of Africa. Proof that grievances, left unresolved long enough, rarely stay contained to their original size or their original cause. Set the piracy story aside for a moment, because a real, legal fishing industry does still exist in Somalia, and understanding how it actually operates today is its own story. Most Somali fishing remains genuinely small-scale. Artisanal fishers work from modest boats using hand lines, gill nets, and long lines, a world away from the industrial trawlers that still fish Somali waters illegally offshore. The single biggest constraint on turning that catch into real income has always been what happens after the fish comes out of the water. Post-harvest losses run as high as 30 to 40% of the total catch, almost entirely because of inadequate cold storage and transport, fish simply spoiling before it can reach a buyer. Fixing that gap has become the sector's main rebuilding project. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization built a cold storage facility in Eyl, the same isolated fishing town that once served as Somali piracy's unofficial capital, and equipped local fishing boats with ice boxes so they can stay out at sea longer without losing their catch. The choice of location is not incidental. Rebuilding a legitimate fish storage business in the exact village where the ransom economy once operated is as close as this story gets to closing its own loop. In Somaliland, the Regional Ministry of Livestock and Fisheries has installed refrigeration units in a string of coastal villages: Maid, Hees, Bulahar, Sela, Lasserwain, and Laskare, each one extending how far a fisherman's catch can travel before it spoils. Fishing itself in Somalia remains largely men's work, but the rest of the value chain runs heavily on women's labor. Women dominate net making and mending, fish processing and marketing, and services to the boats themselves, like selling fuel or renting out refrigeration space. In Mogadishu, a cooperative called the Kaahiye Women's Fisheries Cooperative, more than 150 women, has spent recent years pushing into a business long treated as exclusively male, sorting fish, serving customers, and running daily sales at what used to be an all-male market. For many of them, it's described as less a job than a first real path to financial independence. Processing has followed the same logic. In Bosaso, Puntland's commercial port city, fish processing now happens locally rather than shipping raw, unprocessed catch elsewhere. The Hafun Fish and Processing Plant runs a fully vertical operation, handling everything from the initial catch through final sale under one roof. The port of Bosaso itself functions as Puntland's official seaport, the physical choke point through which a growing share of the region's legal seafood trade now moves. None of this infrastructure is large by international standards. A handful of cold storage sheds, one vertically integrated plant, refrigeration units scattered across a half-dozen villages. But each piece represents the same basic bet, that a fisherman who can keep his catch cold for one more day is a fisherman who no longer needs a foreign buyer, a smuggling route, or a ransom economy to make that catch worth something. Even with that infrastructure improving, Somalia's export market stays narrower than its fishing grounds could support. Most legal exports currently go to Gulf country buyers, largely because the sector still lacks widespread international food safety certifications like HACCP and ISO, the paperwork and process standards that markets like the European Union and East Asia require before they'll import seafood at all. Until that changes, Somalia's fish keeps selling into a smaller, closer set of markets than its actual catch could reach. The growth numbers, off a genuinely low base, are real. Somalia's legal fish exports climbed from $9.9 million in 2017 to $51.3 million in 2022, roughly 400% growth in 5 years. Private companies are building out the value chain piece by piece. Ustan Seafood specializes in live, fresh, chilled, and frozen lobster and fish for export. And the Somali Seafood Export Association works to connect and promote exporters trying to reach markets beyond the Gulf. The specific targets for growth are tuna and lobster, the two highest value species Somali waters can produce, and the two most likely to justify the investment needed to meet international certification standards. Lobster prices alone show how volatile that opportunity still is. Somali export prices ran $27.08 per kilogram in 2017, fell to $21.76 in 2018, and $20.77 in 2019, then jumped to $30.20 in 2020, a swing of nearly 50% in 3 years, in a market too thin and too young to have stabilized yet. The security side of the rebuild is running in parallel. The EU-backed EUCAP Somalia mission has spent years training the Puntland Maritime Police Force in seamanship, navigation, and vessel boarding and search procedures, running joint exercises with EU NAVFOR's own patrol ships outside Somali territorial waters. A direct, if still modest, attempt to replace the Coast Guard Somalia lost in 1991 with something more durable than international patrols alone. Industry groups talk openly about expanding beyond current Gulf buyers into East Asia, the European Union, and East African regional markets. But every one of those markets depends on solving the same certification and cold chain problems described in the previous section first. Somalia has also started fighting for control of its own water through formal channels, not just informal patrols. In 2014, Somalia's federal government took Kenya to the International Court of Justice over more than 100,000 square kilometers of disputed seafloor in the Indian Ocean. The court ruled in October 2021, drawing a new boundary that landed much closer to Somalia's original claim than Kenya's, including offshore oil blocks Kenya had been counting as its own. The ruling is legally binding, even though the court itself has no way to enforce it. Even a clean legal win like that one has limits, though. The tuna species that make Somali waters so valuable are highly migratory, crossing dozens of national economic zones and the open high seas alike, which is why they're managed regionally through the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, rather than by any single country alone. Winning a boundary dispute settles who owns the seafloor. It does not, by itself, settle who gets to catch a fish that swims through 5 other countries' waters the same year. More strikingly, Somalia has quietly turned the original problem, foreign vessels fishing its waters, into a source of legal revenue for the first time in more than 2 decades. Under the 2014 Somali Fisheries Law, the country formally established its exclusive economic zone, and in a subsequent agreement, the federal government and Somalia's regional member states worked out how to split the proceeds. 30% to the federal government, the remaining 70% divided among the regions. Under a Memorandum of Understanding with the China Fisheries Association, Somalia has now issued 31 licenses to Chinese longline vessels to fish legally inside its own waters. Vessels required to stay beyond 24 kilometers of the coastline, declare their position and catch, and submit to automatic tracking. It is, in effect, the same activity that triggered the entire piracy crisis 3 decades ago, now running through a permit system instead of a power vacuum. Put the current numbers next to the sustainable ceiling, and the size of the opportunity, and the size of the failure so far, becomes obvious. Somalia's combined domestic and illegal foreign catch in 2022 came to roughly 19,000 metric tons. The estimated sustainable potential is more than 200,000 metric tons a year. That gap, north of 10 times the current total catch, is the real, wider bet behind everything else in this story. An old resource, present the entire time, still waiting on the security, infrastructure, and market access needed to actually use it. Somalia's coastline never stopped being valuable. The same monsoon upwelling that has fed tuna migrations through these waters for longer than anyone has been counting was still happening every single year through the entire piracy crisis, indifferent to hijackings, ransom negotiations, and international naval deployments happening on the surface above it. The resource was never the problem. Who controlled access to it, and under what rules, was the entire problem for 3 straight decades. Run the comparison side by side. and the last 3 decades come into sharper focus. A country with Africa's longest coastline and one of its richest unfished fisheries produced, almost simultaneously, one of the century's most disruptive piracy crises, and a legal export industry that has grown 400% in 5 years, off a base so small it barely registered globally. Both of those things trace back to the same root cause: a government that collapsed in 1991 and left 3,333 kilometers of coastline with nobody guarding it. The piracy crisis, at its peak, cost the global shipping industry billions of dollars a year in security costs, rerouted trade, and ransom payments, a wildly disproportionate global cost for a problem that started as a local fight over stolen fish. The legal fishing industry, by contrast, is still worth barely $50 million a year in exports, a fraction of what the water underneath it could actually support. Somalia spent 3 decades exporting fear across an entire ocean before it managed to meaningfully export $50 million of seafood. And the second number is still growing off the smallest possible base, propped up by cold storage projects and processing plants built one coastal village at a time. And the 2 threads of this story have started, quietly, to converge. The same foreign fishing that once operated with total impunity, now, in a small but growing number of cases, operates under a Somali government permit, with a share of the licensing revenue actually reaching Somali institutions instead of disappearing entirely. The same coastline that once had no legal boundary worth defending now has one drawn by the world's highest court in Somalia's favor over more than 100,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. None of this undoes 3 decades of stolen fish or hijacked ships, but for a country that spent a generation with no functioning claim to its own water at all, a permit system and a court ruling are not small things. Most stories about a collapsed state and a stolen resource end with the resource simply gone, extracted and shipped away for good. Somalia's story is stranger than that, because the same power vacuum that let foreign trawlers strip its waters also produced the men who fought back against them. And that fight, however justified at the start, spiraled into a piracy crisis that did more damage to Somalia's global reputation than the fish theft it was originally protesting ever did. 3 decades later, the coastline is still Africa's longest, the fish are still there, and the actual industry built to catch and sell them legally is still small enough to fit inside a handful of cold storage sheds and one vertically integrated processing plant in Bosaso. Rebuilding a fishing industry after that kind of history was never going to be a straight line, and by every honest measure, it still isn't one. Eyl is still there, still fishing, its cold storage shed sitting in roughly the same spot where ransom negotiations for hijacked crews once took place. A woman named Asha Abdikarim has been fishing out of Eyl since 1999, before the town's piracy years began, through their entire rise and fall, and into whatever this current, quieter chapter turns out to be. She never stopped being what the town was originally built around, long before anyone outside Somalia had heard of it. The line between the two isn't as clean as a headline would like. Plenty of the men who ran that ransom economy never went back to fishing at all, and plenty of the fish still leaving Somali waters today does so through a licensing system that only exists because the alternative got too expensive and too dangerous for everyone involved. What Somalia's coastline actually proves is less dramatic than a redemption story and more useful than one. That even a resource stripped bare by 30 years of theft, violence, and neglect doesn't stay worthless forever once someone finally builds the boring infrastructure. A cold storage shed, a licensing office, a court filing, needed to claim it back. If you want more stories like this one, where an industry's real history turns out to be far stranger and more complicated than the headline ever suggested, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens when the next unlikely industry gets the same close look.